Welcome back to Itasco Composite High School, ladies and gentlemen. I'm hoping that when you leave here today, you knew just a little bit more about how to analyze the source. And as you analyze the source, once you get through that step, then you're ready to respond to the source. Now here's a little insight. We do A2 after we've already looked at A1 because some of the things that we've talked about, some of the tools and strategies we've talked about with your A1 transfer to an A2. So when we look at an A1, what are we looking for? We're looking for an ideological perspective. We're trying to connect that to nationalism. We're trying to connect it to values and assumptions. Trying to look for some kind of vision for society as it is and how it should be. We might look at it and say, what's the significance of what is being said? Is there a problem embedded in the source? Is there some kind of solution that we can unpack as well? The solution should reflect the ideology, the beliefs and values and assumptions about government, about society, the purpose of life, the role of the individual, the role of citizens. And those steps that we do from an A1, we can do here in the analysis on an A2. So there is a great overlap between an A1 and an A2 just for this first part, the analysis of source, very similar to an interpretation of source. So I want to make that clear. So here's the source that we will be looking at in grade 11 and in grade 12. It's very reflective of the pattern that you will see on your diploma exam. Individualism creates division that destroys society. The path to a nation's full potential is best achieved through collectivism. I would always recommend that you read the source once to see the whole picture. And then you go back with a highlighter and highlight key terms. So I would highlight individualism. I might highlight the idea of division that destroys society. I might highlight things like nation's full potential and best achieved through collectivism. There's a lot of things I've highlighted there. Those are things I'd call the big rocks. Big rocks include words like individualism and collectivism, division, nation's full potential. Sometimes it's not a word but a phrase. And the point of highlighting these big rocks is now we know what we should unpack in our analysis. That in order to have and looking at, the rubric, in order to be sophisticated and comprehensive when we unpack the source, when we analyze it, we want to make sure that we don't accidentally ignore some of the big rocks. So that's why I always suggest we highlight some of those key terms. So here I would argue the key terms are individualism and collectivism, and there's a contrast there. Creates division, destroys society, nation's full potential. And even the word best changes the perspective. Let's say that it said the path to a nation's full potential is only achieved through collectivism. That's different than best. It's more absolute. So you have to consider what's there and what's not there as you begin to unpack it. So far, I've said a lot, but I've said nothing. I've said read the source once, holistically see big picture, what is it about? This one's about our relationship with each other, our relationship with our government, our nation. Then go back, highlight big rocks, key terms that we know we want to somehow unpack, analyze as we can complete a number of steps. So, read the prompt once to identify the theme of the source. Here we have many possible themes. Role of government, role of citizen. So for example, centuries-old freedom versus control struggle between individuals and governments and the resulting and sometimes evolving relationships that citizens have with their government is seen within the source. The evolution of society, the evolution of our social contract between ourselves and our government, the purpose of government, the role of citizen. Are we expected to be obedient to unlock a good life for us and the full potential of our nation, or are we expected to be free and therefore pursue our individual path for the glory of the group? So that's the theme. So when I'm actually writing this up, I may begin, my first sentence might be something like, the source provided offers insight into the theme of, and then I'm going to identify the theme. I don't need to wax poetically an introduction to this assignment. It can be somewhat, I don't want to use the word formulaic, but very utilitarian in the sense that you're going to get right to the point. So, you know, the source provided offers some insight into the theme of, and then announce the theme. So into the theme of freedom versus control, that, you know, centuries-long struggle between individuals and government and the resulting, sometimes evolving relationship within our social contract. That might be my topic sentence of, or not topic sentence, my first sentence of my analysis paragraph. Once I've identified the theme, or maybe possible themes, I really like to look at what is the purpose of what is being said. And again, looking at this beyond the assignment, beyond the diploma exam, what are we really teaching people here? We're teaching you to listen to others and try to identify the purpose behind what people are saying. You know, why are you saying this? So identify the goal of the statement. Here, the goal of this statement is full potential. It says, the path to a nation's full potential is best achieved through collectivism. The goal isn't collectivism. Collectivism is a means to an end. The end is nation's full potential. So often, the source will use somewhat vague language to allow students an opportunity to demonstrate their knowledge. So unpack the term full potential. When the source says full potential, we can infer that it could mean this, this, and this. So from the perspective of an economist, full potential might be measured in GDP. From the perspective of the Sultan of Brunei, it's gross national happiness. Other economists might say per capita income. Some might think beyond economics and start looking at sociological factors and begin to not talk about standard of living, but more the quality of life. You know, do you have clean air? Do you have political and social freedom? Also, when we look at the term full potential, we can consider it as a macro and a micro term. Macroeconomically, full potential is a GDP measurement. How strong is the government's economy? But microeconomically, it's per capita income. Macro is nationwide. Micro is at the individual level. So even just looking at the term full potential, we can see that the vagueness of the source allows us an opportunity to analyze. Most students read past those opportunities to analyze. And they just generally and very straightforwardly say the source is suggesting that collectivism is our path to achieving full potential. And when they say collectivism, they're saying socialism, and then they just jump right into that, right? Let's be a little more sophisticated. Let's be a little more precise, right? So when the source says full potential, try to figure out what does that mean? Once we've identified the goal of the source, the purpose of the statement, to achieve our full potential as a nation, it's also important to unpack what is the significance of who defines full potential. So when we look at the significance of who defines full potential, we're also looking at the division of society surrounding the source. Fascists may envision full potential as the strong controlling the weak, the strong feeding on the weak, using ultranationalism, social Darwinism, fascism as an aggressive and militant foreign policy as a means to their end. But that's not the way Marx would define full potential. That's not the way John Locke would define. So as we define full potential, it's also significant to outline that these words are subject to some division within society, some conversation, some not convergence, but some divergence of understanding what full potential should be. So from the perspective of Sorel, Schopenhauer, Gentile, full potential is achieved by submitting to the state. From the perspective of John Locke, your full potential is to have a government that allows you to explore and expand your individuality, your freedom. Two different definitions of full potential. So, in contrast to fascism, we would say communists envision full potential as obtaining egalitarianism. Marx said, from each according to his ability to each according to his need. Is the full potential of our country being met? A Marxist would say, have we done this? A fascist would be saying the opposite. We don't want to give to those weakest in our society. We want to prey on them. So the full potential of a fascist looks different than a full potential of a communist. So even though the source doesn't announce itself as communist or fascist, it uses a word that is an opportunity to demonstrate your understanding of the divergence surrounding it. Capitalists envision full potential as wealth of a nation being unlocked through the invisible hand. That's Adam Smith. That's laissez-faire. You got lots of chances to go back to Social 9 and talk about that. Political conservatives might argue that full potential might include ties to our great chain of being. That my full potential cannot betray those whose sacrifices allowed me to be here today. That my full potential should not leave me adrift from my morals and traditions that allowed me to be here. Progressives may argue that full potential is a term that must acknowledge the fluidity of self-identity, including fluidity of gender. Full potential might be something that changes. How we measure it in 2023 will be different than how it's measured in 2050. Full potential. So, step 1, identify the theme. There's many themes that we should expect to see this year or next. Step 2, underneath that theme, the source is presenting a goal, full potential. That's the purpose of the statement, is to provide us a means to full potential. But we've taken just that one term that we highlighted, full potential, and we unpacked what it could mean and the divisions of society surrounding what it could mean. And we can do that with all the key terms. Identify and discuss the problem inherent in the source. The problem might be explicit, it might be implicit, but there's a problem within the source. The problem is a challenge or an issue that is getting in the way of the goal. So what is getting in the way of full potential? Individualism creates division that destroys society. The path to a nation's full potential is best achieved through collectivism. So what is getting in the way? A divided society that is the result of individualism. So the obstacle to achieving our full potential is our society's divided. Why is it divided? Because we have been practicing individualism. So by identifying the obstacles, we're further analyzing the source. This is what the source wants. This is why we're not getting it. So if somebody comes up to you and presents an argument, it's logical that if you're analyzing it, you'd be like, this is what you're saying you want, but this is what you're saying why we're not getting it. These are very logical things to do. Logical is at least 80%. So it's logical to unpack the challenge or the problem, the obstacle getting in the way. Here the challenge is the destruction of society, the division of society. So division that destroys society, right? So taken to an extreme, the challenge is that society is being destroyed through our division because of individualism. Why is it significant that we address this issue? And you can use this as a sentence, taken to an extreme. If society doesn't address the issue presented, we may arrive at what? In Social 10, the answer was always the death of birth. In Social 30, the answer might be totalitarianism, a dystopian future like 1984 or Big Brother, or Brave New Worlds under Huxley's vision. Now, this year, we're unpacking nationalism. So we'll have to kind of wrestle with what would a flawed version of nationalism, what might that mean for us if we lived under that? So taken to an extreme, if society doesn't address this issue, we may arrive at a destroyed society. That's what it's saying. So use evidence to further the perspective. I've been marking some Social 30 stuff this morning. And one thing that they keep forgetting to do is you can use evidence to further the perspective on the page. When the source makes this claim, it could be a reference to this. When the source says this, when the source says it's destroying society, here's some evidence that one could use to further that perspective. It might be a reference to this. So going back to Social 10, the term destruction of society offers an example of how individualism could destroy society. Here we have economic individualism can destroy society as selfish, short-term thinking, common to capitalism, can create ecological changing conditions that might lead to the death of birth. So back to something you're familiar with, that's how we can show the destruction of society. When the source claims that individualism is destroying society, it could be a reference to this. Economic individualism, global capitalism, has led to ecological externality that is destroying the biosphere, leading to the death of birth. But maybe you don't want to talk about economics. Maybe you're like, you know what, I've wrote that essay multiple times. Can we talk about politics maybe instead? Well, look at political individualism and how it can destroy society. Political individualism can destroy society as it can encourage division and disunity that could tear apart the unity of a nation. You could look into the United States and the tribalism that exists among Republicans and Democrats. You could look at the increased animosity between liberals and conservatives here in Canada, and our ability, or our lack of ability sometimes to live as neighbors and to accept common policies. You could introduce the freedom to question the state, led to the downfall of the Soviet Union. So political individualism, political freedom, when it was allowed in the USSR, this openness, glasnost, when glasnost became a policy under Gorbachev, instead of saving the Soviet Union, that actually destroyed society. So we have evidence that individualism does destroy society. Political individualism destroyed the society that was the USSR. Now maybe that was a good thing, but it happened, is my point. What about social individualism? Now politics and economics are often more exact sciences than sociology, right? So social individualism can destroy society. Perhaps a hypothetical example could further this. One where at a social level there's so much disunity that there's no longer any norms that as a group we can adhere to, and therefore our self-expression creates some kind of chaotic arena. Are we there yet? No, but you know, sadly I'm seeing us drifting towards that. That, you know, at a social level, because we have less and less norms that hold us together as a unified collective, as a nation, because we become so excited about self-expression that our common space has become more and more chaotic and therefore more and more combative. All we do is challenge each other, right? Point out how everyone's different and wrong. You can connect to theory. And again, Sorel, Schopenhauer, Gentile, philosophers that end up being used by fascists. A society will tend to decay unless it is led by an authoritarian leader. That would echo the sentiments within the source. Again, to continue the previous attempt at addressing the significance of the issue presented and any related division of society, we could further unpack the language. Unpacking the language is the single most important thing I'm telling you to do here. Unpack the language, connect it to nationalism. Unpack the need for division of thought, the need for dissent, the need for protest and opposition as it connects to the source. So the source claims that individualism creates division that destroys society. Therefore, the source is based on an anti-individualist bias that assumes that division isn't the purpose of society. So under that umbrella, you could talk about the need for those things. Like, do we have a need for dissent? The source is saying, no, that's going to destroy society. Do we have a need for protest and opposition? Here in Canada, our opposition party is called the loyal opposition. There's this idea that in opposition there's loyalty, that you're doing a service to the nation by opposing the state. The source would suggest that that is a fallacy. After you've talked about the problem that inspired the source, then you can jump into the solution. So very logical. You know, here's what the source is saying thematically. And underneath that we got to this is the problem. This is the goal that they want. Sorry, this is the goal. Then this is the obstacle why we're not getting there. Now here's the solution. So theme, goal, obstacle, solution. These are things you remember from grade 10. So the solution should lead us to the ideological perspective, and when we analyze the source, we're meant to find the perspective. And when we uncover the perspective, I want you to talk about the values, the principles, the assumptions that it makes. Values and principles it's based upon, and the assumptions it's making. Because your job after you analyze the source and pull out the perspective is to respond to the perspective under the context of the theme. Identify the solution that is promoted. Well, the source is saying that our full potential is best achieved through collectivism. Again, the analysis is dependent upon breaking down language. Here it clearly states best achieved through collectivism. Outline values associated with the ideological perspective. This time it's easy, as it's the values associated with collectivism. So things like common good, collective interest, cooperation, adherence to collective norms, values, collective identity, public property, economic equality. These will be in page 80 of the textbook in Social 30. But being that we're in 20, I've listed them right there for you. But there is still some complexity here with the source. Even though that we can identify here are the values associated with collectivism, we might have people like Hitler and Stalin that both proclaim that they share those values. But they share them to create a different world at the end. They have a different world vision, completely opposing each other. In theory, communism is trying to unlock egalitarianism, and in theory, fascism is trying to magnify inequality. Should be able to connect the theme to other themes like the viability of liberalism, the role of nationalism. How does this theme of embracing collectivism, how does it associate with nationalism? Now, once we have this is the solution they have, and this is what the solution means, we can also talk about evidence that would further the solution. We're not writing an essay here to defend the thesis, but we could highlight evidence. So, for example, Marx would argue that individualism perpetuates a cycle of class conflict, and that it is only through collectivism that we can reach the end of history by achieving a utopia here on Earth. If I want to talk more about Marxism and defend the thesis, I'm going to leave that for my body. But I can highlight some evidence here to further the perspective. And that's what that sentence does. For Marx, capitalism would inevitably sow the seeds of its own destruction. The bourgeoisie produces its own gravediggers. He wrote, although the revolutions that wrecked the Soviet Union and China earlier in the century were undertaken in the name of Marx, modern-day Marxists are usually quite critical of the communistic societies that have emerged, particularly with the emphasis on central planning and authoritarian rule. So I've also included some rabbit holes that you can fall down here as you plan your essay. Also connected to the solution, we have theory like Hobbes. Hobbes would argue that individualism promotes freedom, and freedom would unleash our natural violent tendencies that will result in brutal and short lives. We must devolve into a state of war, or we would devolve into a state of war with each other. That's why we have to embrace collectivism. Hobbes would echo the sentiment in the source. Therefore, the source has, an undertone of Hobbesian logic based upon observations about the nature of man and the need for a social contract. Then we have Rousseau. Rousseau would argue that individualism creates the malaise of modernity. We talked about that, malaise of modernity, as it promotes selfishness and jealousy that divides the people. So even though we're at the beginning of Social 20, we already have some theory that you can use to unpack the source and respond to it. So, what ideology or values or assumptions is the source challenging or rejecting? How is the source challenging or rejecting nationalism? Is something here in 20 you must consider. You have to make that connection. So going back to the source, it's saying that the path to a nation's full potential is best achieved through collectivism, not only. So we know that the source is highlighting the fact that a nation's full potential might be achieved through a nation that has some individualism. But the term best is highlighting the path that should be chosen. So this is a sense of nationalism as defined by the collective through the government. So the government's defining nationalism here. So one of the only stumbling points that I've seen so far this year is that you guys stumble on connecting things to nationalism. This isn't celebrating a grassroots definition of nationalism where each person has their own unique take on what does it mean to be Canadian. This source is promoting one vision of a nation within a nation that we can infer is being clarified by the state, being indoctrinated into citizens in their youth, something very similar to a totalitarian state and their use of ultranationalism to both unify and control the people. We can also look at, maybe what is the source assuming? The source is making some assumptions about the nature of mankind or the purpose of life. This source is assuming that the purpose of life is to fulfill the full potential of the nation, not to fulfill the full potential of me. So you can connect to Maslow, you can connect to others that talked about the purpose of life. The role of the state, the role of citizen in ensuring the purpose of life. Giovanni Gentile says serving the state gives your life purpose. And maybe Gentile was right. We can see that in wealthy, developed countries, there's a number of people that seem to have very little purpose in life. They may be wealthy, but they're unhappy because freedom has allowed them to be adrift. They don't know what they should be doing next. Whereas in a developing country or an authoritarian country at times, citizens often have quite clear purpose given to them, provided to them, either by their circumstance, by their human condition, or by their state. And because there's clarity in their purpose, there's happiness in their day. A recent survey asked people, how happy are you with globalization? Is globalization a force of good or bad? Developing countries like Vietnam, 91% of Vietnamese people said globalization is a force of good. Sweatshops are in Vietnam. Where are these transnationals coming from that are exploiting the Vietnamese people? America. Only 40% of Americans said globalization is a force of good, and 37% of the French said it's good. As many French people said it was good, 37%, as they said it was bad. So we have developed countries that are looking at globalization and saying, oh, it's also a force of bad. Whereas you have developing countries, often authoritarian countries, that see the good because it provides clarity and purpose. We can continue our discussion about the division of society here. We can talk about Adam Smith. You often can insert some quotes to further the analysis. It's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, that you expect your breakfast. It's from the invisible hand. And then ultimately, once you get through the division of society, logically, what is the last voice that you should end your analysis with? Your voice. And what is your voice? It's your thesis statement. So it's a pretty logical flow of events here. Going back to the beginning, the first step, let's just identify the theme. Once you've identified the theme, underneath that theme, the source is saying, here's our goal. This is the purpose of why this statement's been made. But typically, the goal will not be being met. There's some kind of obstacle in the way. So we want you to identify the obstacle. So we go from theme to goal to obstacle. And then a solution. How are we going to get to the goal? And within the solution, there's some values and assumptions. There should be opportunity to show a division of society, some complexity of the issue, and some significance. If left unaddressed, this is how bad life will get. But through that division of society, naturally, the last voice that we should hear from is yours. Now, although this is a different step, I'm going to end it with a quick look at thesis statements. There's no set way that your thesis statement has to look. It's just your response to the source. But most students see some aspects of the source that they want to embrace, but some aspects that they disagree on. And if that is you, then I always recommend an although, but, therefore thesis statement. Although, and then you list, this is the part that you like about the source. Although liberty is desirable, there are times when freedoms can be absolute. The danger becomes that in the name of security, freedoms might be lost and that the state might become dystopian. Therefore, we need a state powerful enough to restrict freedom when necessary, but also a citizenry active enough to shape their relationship with their government. Although, but, therefore. Although you're right here, but you're kind of wrong here, therefore we need this. That's one possible way to develop a thesis. Your thesis could be a number of different responses to the source. When you get to that point and you're wondering about your thesis statement, maybe run it by me. But that should give you insight into your analysis of source.